In this video, we're going to cover 3 syllabus points. First, 1.1.2, calculate payments based on government allowances and pensions. We're going to do 1.1.3, prepare a personal budget for given income, taking into account the fixed and discretionary spending. So we're going to focus on those two terms. And finally, we're going to calculate the dividend paid on a portfolio of shares, given the percentage dividend or the dividend paid for each share, so we'll have to work with both, and compare share values by calculating a price to earnings ratio. The good thing about all of these syllabus points are that they're pretty clear-cut questions. There's no different way to ask you most of these questions, but some of them take time and you need to set out your calculations carefully to make sure you don't miss parts. I'm going to follow the order of the textbook, so let's start with shares. So some people choose to invest their money by buying shares in company. If the company does well, the share price may increase. And shares can be quite tricky. You need to try and find a time or buy or invest in shares just before that company peaks. For example, lithium and WA, people who invested in lithium earlier made quite a bit of money by investing in those shares because the market has grown exponentially for lithium trades. So the investor may see the value of their investments rise as the share price increases. And for some shares, you actually get a payment, an annual payment from the company. Now, this is called the dividend. So the dividend is the payment you get from the company if they're doing really well. The company may decide not to distribute all of the profits to the investors, preferring to reinvest back to the company, allowing the company to expand, and that's a very worthwhile scheme. The company may not make profit every year. Some years it may just break even or perhaps make a loss, and the share price could drop in value, decreasing the total value of the shares owned. All of the shares an investor owns in various companies make up a portfolio. So shares are risky business. There are less risky shares that you can invest in. And when you do superannuation, a lot of that money is actually put into shares decided by your superannuation company. For those of you who do economics, you probably do look at the Australian stock market and do the ASX game. So you might have a better idea of this. Mainly for applications, the big things are knowing that there's a dividend, or some companies give you a dividend, the share price, and the price to earnings ratio. They're the key ideas that you need to know for apps. So let's have a look at some of the calculations you'll be asked to do. So this is a portfolio from an investor. He's got shares in the following companies. And we need to calculate the total value of his portfolio and the total dividend the investor will receive. So let's tackle the total value first. So to work out the total value of this portfolio, we literally take the number of shares they have in a company and multiply it by the current value of that share. Obviously, the value of the shares can fluctuate, so this is a moment in time that they've taken a snapshot for this table. So first of all, we'll have the 5,000 shares of BCD, and that's at 86 cents. You don't have to use brackets here. Obviously, BIMDAS says that you do the multipliers first. I'm just showing them in brackets so you can see which part came where. So then we would do the EFG group at 540 shares multiplied at $23.50 per share. We would then do HIJ, 2,500 at $3.40. And finally, we have the KLM group at 7,000 shares times the 0.54. So calculating that, we would get a total value of 29,270, which is a significant value for shares. Obviously, we don't know how much he bought them for at the start, so we don't know if this has been a profit or a loss, etc. Now what we can do is work out the dividend paid. So like we said, not all companies give a dividend, and sometimes if the company makes a loss or only breaks even, they might not give a dividend at all. So the total dividend, we do the same thing as we did above, but instead of multiplying it by the value, we're going to multiply it by the dividend as listed in the table. So we're going to have the 5,000 multiplied by 0.05 or 5 cents. For EFG, we're going to have 540 shares with a dividend of $1.45. For HIJ, it's going to be 2,500 multiplied by the 28 cents. And finally, for KLM, actually receives no dividend, so we're going to take that away. Calculating all of that, we get the total dividend of $1,733. So basically, the owner of this portfolio would receive an annual dividend of $1,733. So really, that's not a hard calculation for you to do. It's just making sure you set it out well, you don't miss things, rounding, etc. So now we move on to the price to earnings ratio. So the price to earning ratio is showing you how many dollars worth of share value you have to pay out to get $1 of earnings in the year. So basically you have this formula. Now this is on your formula sheet and it's an e-activity as well. Basically, to calculate the price to earnings ratio, you literally take the share price and we divide it by the earnings in the past year. By earnings, we're talking about the dividend. Now, obviously with this, the lower the price to earnings ratio, the better, because it means you're paying out less and getting more value in return. However, you have to be careful in saying that makes it a better share and they're the ones you should invest in. Of course, maybe initially they're the ones you should invest in, but in the long run, you're looking at companies that are going to expand over time. And as we've heard before, some companies don't give a huge dividend. Instead, they reinvest in the company. And sometimes they're the best companies to invest with because over time, the share price is actually going to increase. So you might not be getting a dividend or a decent dividend or a good price to earnings ratio because of that. However, your share price is actually going to be a much higher value in the long run. So you have to be careful. Normally when they're asking questions in applications, they'll say, ignoring other circumstances, which is the best to invest in. And that's when you would say the lower the price to earnings ratio, the better. So they try and take out that other side of the context, but just be really careful in making statements such as, I would invest in this company because their price to earnings ratio is lower. You just have to be really careful and know the other side of things and understand that just because it's a bigger dividend doesn't make it a better company in the long run. So let's do an example. Determine the price to earning ratio for a share with a price of $5.50 and dividends in the last 12 months totaling 44 cents per share. So setting up, we've got the price to earnings ratio, which I simply refer to as price to earnings, equals the share price, which is the $5.50 over the dividend. Now, you do need to make sure they're in the same units. We've used $5.50 in dollars. We need to convert the 44 cents to dollars as well. So that's going to be 0.44. And that will give us a price to earnings ratio of 12.5. So basically, you'd roughly have to spend $12.5 to get $1 in return. So in most of these questions, you'll be comparing shares, calculating total portfolios, and discussing the price to earnings ratio. We now move on to government allowances and pensions. There are 4 specific ones you should know that come up in exams and tests most frequently. Some of them involve tables like the tax tables and the stamp duty tables that we've tackled before. And I know a lot of you struggle with those tables, so it's really important that we come back to it and practice with those segregated or stepped up earnings tables. So these are the 4 you need to know a little bit about to help you in a contextualized question in a test or an exam. First of all, you've got the carer allowance. So basically, if you have someone who needs a carer, so someone with a disability or even a child, etc., you can receive a carer's allowance. The carers receive the allowance irrespective of what they own or what the person that they're caring for owns. It's just a base allowance showing that they are the carer. You have the family tax benefit, which basically is if you have children, the government supports you in having children. Obviously, some families are in more need than others, so it is actually dependent. It depends on your total annual income of the parents or guardians and the number of children that meet the criteria. There's an age limit to the criteria, and we'll explore that a little bit further in an example. So there's lots of criteria you have to meet, and as your income increases, your tax benefit decreases. Now, one that actually might be beneficial for some of you in the next few years if you decide to go to uni is youth allowance. Now, I was on youth allowance when I was at uni. So first of all, you need to prove that you're independent from your parents. That's why lots of students have a gap year. You have to earn a certain amount of money. I'm actually not sure what it is now. When it was for me, it was 21,000. So because of inflation, I'm sure that has increased over time. But over your gap year, you have to show that you are earning money, paying rent, etc., to be able to get this youth allowance. And youth allowance basically supports you through study. Now, again, like the family tax benefit, the pay depends on your fortnightly income. So obviously, the more you earn, the less youth allowance you get. So I would sit at home and calculate what the maximum amount of hours I should earn to get the most money from youth allowance. So there's some tricky bits you can do to try and get the most money. It's a very common allowance that lots of students get. The final one is the age pension. Whether the aged person is given the age pension depends on their assets and the income of the person, and that includes their partners. The one thing that doesn't come into their assets is the value of their home. So if they've paid off their home, they actually don't take that into consideration when they're working out the age pension. So you don't need to remember which one has a dependent on their income, etc. But if you have a fair idea of each of these, it gives you a bit of a leg up when it comes to contextualized questions in an exam. So we're going to look at one in particular, which is the family tax benefit, and you'll get a table that looks like this. So hopefully most of you can see that looks a little similar to the tax tables and the stamp duty tables. So there's two different tables. This one is for families with one child meeting the criteria, and this is for families with two children meeting the criteria. And you can be given questions, and you will have to look at the table, see where they fit, and then calculate it based on that. So it is similar to the tax tables in that you will be given a situation, you need to be able to read the table and give the answer. You normally are given a fair amount of marks for these questions because you have to analyse the table, etc. So let's try this example. Okay, so it's asked us to determine the annual family tax benefit with a family with two children. So we're going to be looking at the second table, meeting the criteria with a combined annual family income of $102,000. So we're looking at the second table, and having the $102,000 annual income puts us in this line here. So to calculate the family tax benefit, we're going to use that information in that particular row. So first of all, we know it's going to be $4,200 less. Now, similar idea to last time, that's how it builds. So less 30 cents for each dollar that the annual income exceeds $98,000. So we're basically going to have our $102,000 subtract the $98,000, and we're going to multiply that by 0.3, which represents the 30 cents. So in calculating that, we get, and that gives us the $3,000. So this family would get the tax benefit of $3,000 for the year. So the challenge with these questions is to make sure you choose the right row depending on the correct situation and then calculate it appropriately. Finally, we're going to look at budgeting. So we are going to do an investigation or a take-home investigation on budgeting, and it doesn't come up in tests and exams too much because they're normally quite lengthy questions and they normally require to use a spreadsheet. Now, you hopefully have noticed that there is one more syllabus point that we haven't covered specifically in the videos, which is 1.1.8, which talks about spreadsheets. We're going to do that in class together with your devices. So we actually are going to use Excel, etc., to build a spreadsheet based on a budget. So the main thing you need to know for tests is the difference between fixed expenditures and discretionary spending. So if we're looking at fixed expenditures are costs that will be fixed per week or fortnight over the whole year. It's something that won't change. So if we're looking at this weekly budget, we can see that this family gets a family benefit of $80 and the salary or wages is $1,250. If you look at things that would be fixed expenditures, we would be looking at things like the car would be a fixed expenditure based on the idea that that's a loan you're paying back on the car. You would also have your gas and electrics as a fixed expenditure, health fund, internet provided that you don't go over your limits. Most of the time, internet these days is unlimited. Your insurances would be fixed, loan repayment would be fixed. Depending on what sort of phone plan you had, if it was a plan, it would be fixed. If it was prepaid, it wouldn't. For my situation, the phone would be fixed, so would rent. And the sport and gym, again, depends if you're signed up to a contract or not. But most of the time you are on a contract, so that would be fixed. Whereas discretionary spending is something that you have discretion over. You can choose to spend more or less than this amount. It's not fixed. So that would be things like bus or train travel if you wanted to go somewhere else other than just work and school. Your clothing, entertainment, food. Some of these others, depending on your context, could probably be listed as discretionary as well. If we ever asked it to you in a test or an exam, we'd make it pretty black and white, and it probably wouldn't be this long a list. For some, I might just go that internet could be discretionary, so could phones, depending on the situation, and technically sports and gym too. Depending on the context, they could go either way. But generally speaking, your fixed expenditures are things like rent, gas and electric, your car repayments. They're all fixed, set over time. Discretionary have that variability in it.